Engineering and technical services make up the bulk of the South African National Roads Agency's commitment to its mandate. And this is a mandate that can get pretty complicated. To find out more, we speak to the engineering executive at SANRAL, Louw Kannemeyer. We're going to talk a lot about road freight, but I want to talk about the business in general. And I just wonder, from your perspective, the mandate for SANRAL.
Yeah, I think if one look at the mandate of SANRAL specifically in terms of our founding act, which is Act 7 of 1998, it's got a very specific focus on what is referred to as the national roads of South Africa. So that is really, we're responsible for the planning, the design, the maintenance, the management of the national road network, which as we sit here today makes up about 23,600 kilometers out of a total network of 750,000 kilometers in the country. So it's a very small part, but it's a very critical part. It is really the economic arteries of the country. So although we make up about 3.6% of the total network, we're currently responsible for carrying over 70% of all the road freight in the country is moving on that network of ours. And if one look at the total vehicle kilometers traveled annually in the country, nearly 40% of that occurs on the SANRAL network, highlighting the critical economic importance of the national road network of South Africa.
What would you say has been the biggest challenge then? Because you come up with models, but you can't factor in just how many cars might come onto the road, how many trucks suddenly appear on our roads, and also climate change. So what are the big issues that you're constantly having to look at?
Yeah, I think what's very important to understand when one look at decisions we make around roads, we can't change how a road looks today. The decision you make today doesn't change what you see out there, but it changes what you'll see 8 to 15 years from now. So all our decisions are based on forecasting into the future. And as you say, it is not that easy to, for example, forecast commodity pricing cycles that suddenly results in a near doubling of traffic on a certain corridor that you never foreseen. So those are all part and part of the challenges that through continuous monitoring of traffic movements along our corridors, we're able to adjust our forecasted. We've got a 30-year model forecast in terms of predictions, what's going to happen, and maintenance strategies for each of our national roads. And we're continuously adjusting that with the reality of what is happening on these corridors. But yes, it remains challenging because, for example, we may never have foreseen a mine developing along a certain corridor. And then suddenly there's this discovery and the mine opens up and it changes the traffic pattern completely. We have to readjust, we have to remodel, and then we have to see how we take it forward.
Let's talk about the weather, because climate change suddenly has become a topic of conversation, and we're seeing sustainability of businesses being looked at. How much of a role does that play in the road network?
Yeah, I think it's important if you look at the South African road design, which we've developed in the country, because we don't have our own crude oil. We use what we call bitumen. So a lot of people will talk about tar, but the black stuff on the top, which is the waterproofing layer, is the residue that remains when you refine crude oil. And because we don't have a lot of our own crude oil, bitumen is relatively expensive. So what we have done over the years, we have substituted thick bitumen layers with granular gravel layers and very thin surfacings. So by doing that, we were able to reduce the cost by 40 to 50% of constructing roads in South Africa. But the risk is that thin surfacing, if it cracks, it allows moisture to go through that surfacing, penetrate the granular layers, and we all know what happens to gravel or granular when it gets wet. It loses its ability to carry load. So our biggest challenge really in terms of the road sector in South Africa is moisture. And I think what we've seen in the past 3 years with the above normal rainfall, we would see suddenly, because the network is relatively old, the surface is cracked. When it rained, water was allowed to go through the surface to the granular gravel layers, and you start seeing potholes popping up everywhere.
Wow. Okay. So that's nature. But there are issues that have now seen more pressure on your roads. Partly Transnet. It's had its own historical issues. And also, I think we were chatting off camera about shifts in commodity prices. And that's had an impact on the number of trucks on the roads, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think, what we've seen specifically in the last 2 years, for example, with the commodity price boom, specifically coal, for example, we've seen the price going from between $100 to $200 to between $600 to $700 at some point last year. That suddenly created this demand for coal. And because Transnet was not in a position to respond for this increased demand, it resulted in it being taken up by road-related or road transport. So we have seen on some of our corridors the daily trucks going from like 800-900 per day to 2,500 per day in a matter of weeks to respond to this demand in terms of the international demand for coal and get the product that we've got a lot of to the market through, say, for example, Richards Bay Harbour.
So how do you respond to increase in volumes? Do you build more roads or you repair at a much faster rate?
Yeah, so obviously what will happen is that one will need to first say, what's the long-term sustainability of this demand? Is it a short-term spike? So once again, it comes back to that modeling. But normally what will then happen is that with such a substantial increase in demand, one will then enter into a phase of having to reconstruct and potentially what we will see doubling up those corridors to freeway standards to be able to in the future withstand these cycles and these demand spikes that we're seeing.
What role does regulation and controls play in the freight industry, play on the work that you do and maintaining our roads?
Yeah, I think what's a very big challenge for us at SANRAL is that as a road owner, being responsible for managing the national road network, we have no enforcement powers. So we cannot police who's using and who's driving on our roads. And I think also if one look at the regulations in the country, if you've got your vehicle is roadworthy and licensed and your driver is licensed and he's got his professional driver's permit, I have no regulation to tell you you have no business being on this national road. I have to allow you to be there. And I think that is part of the challenge that we have. Up till 1988, it was heavily regulated. You had to have a permit to transport something by road. Then it was totally opened up. So we're now in a scenario where some level of control needs to be reintroduced, that it's not like what we see for now, a free-for-all, where anybody can just decide tomorrow I buy a truck and I'm start driving on this route, transporting this commodity.
And also I think sometimes we underestimate overloading and the impact that can have. You as on your own truck think you're the only one on the roads, but if we multiply that out by X number of trucks, that becomes an issue, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think what's very important to understand is when we design a road, there's two things we look at from a traffic perspective. Total number of vehicles, lights and heavies combined, that determines the number of lanes we need to get a certain level of service. So in major metropolitan areas here in the Gauteng, you see these massive SANRAL roads with a lot of lanes per direction. That is to ensure adequate level of service. If you move more rural, you'll see the number of lanes drop the traffic. That's the one part. Then the truck traffic. So the number of trucks on the road is very crucial in terms of the design of the road layers. So in an urban street here in town where maybe you have the refuse truck once a week, that total thickness of the pavement layers below the surface that you don't see is about 200 to 300 millimeters. On a national road like the N3, we're talking about 1 to 1.4 meters. So it's a substantial cost difference. Now what happens, as you say, with trucks? So if we've designed for the next 25 years for currently 200 trucks a day, and suddenly the trucks jump to 2,000 trucks a day, it means a road that would have lasted 20 years in terms of the design axles we've designed for, has now carried its design traffic in 2 years. And that's really the challenge we face with this big changes in traffic that happens when you have these commodity cycles, is you really can reach the design traffic from a truck perspective in a very short time frame on a specific road.
So looking into the future, again, you've got crystal balls and you can only guess, but what kind of models are you working on? Because we are going into a green era, so there'll be less diesel and petrol cars and trucks on the road. Will that have an impact on the kind of materials you use to construct? And is the science getting better in terms of the kinds of materials you'll use in the future?
I think we're continuously doing research on how we can do better with what we have. So, for example, we just last year published a new technical guideline on the use of nanosaline modifiers. Now, to give you an idea what that technology does, it enables us to use material we previously discarded, which we saw not as suitable for road construction. Using this technology, we've been able to drop the cost to 3 to 4 million. So with the same budget, we can do 2 to 3 times the network length. So that is what technology does. I think what's important in terms of the vehicle technology, the impact of that is going to come on how do we generate the revenue to maintain our roads. Because at the moment, our revenue comes from the fuel levy and vehicle license fees. With people moving to hybrid or electric vehicles, a full electric vehicle is currently not paying any fuel levy. They are not contributing to maintaining roads, yet they are
using them.
The roads in the same manner as a normal vehicle in terms of that. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges we're going to have, not just in South Africa, but everywhere. How are we going to be paying for maintaining our roads in future when you have electric vehicles roaming the streets?
All right. And perhaps the final question, because we were talking about road freight. What's your biggest wish in terms of what needs to happen so that you as a maintainer and a builder can have a great relationship with the users, the freight industry?
Yeah, I think generally as SANRAL, I think we've got a very good relationship with the industry out there. I think, as I said, the biggest challenge we just have is we actually have no control over who legally uses that infrastructure. And I think it's really, and I think you would have heard about the pronouncements from the minister in terms of the establishment of the single transport economic regulator. And I think that will go a very far part because the regulator will hopefully be enabled to set the correct pricing for the various modes of transport, road and rail, so that the playing field is level. Because at the moment, there are indications that potentially truck freight is being cross-subsidized by light vehicles to the detriment of rail. And I think if we have such an independent economic regulator that sets a fair market price for road and rail so that the playing field is level, I think that will then ensure more sustainable transport going forward in South Africa.
Louw, it's been a great first conversation. I certainly look forward to more chats in the future, but thanks for joining us today.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity.
And so it's all about the road ahead. See you next week for more insights on how SANRAL is changing lives.